The woman in pearls slid a brass key across the table and said the family wanted her to have something. Her uncle laughed out loud, said the county had tried to condemn that boathouse twice and given up, that it wasn't worth the gas to drive out and look at it. A tax appraisal from 1994 valued the structure at $5. Wren Salter was 18 years old that morning. She had $187, a paper bag of clothes, and no address. She closed her hand around the key, and the old lawyer across the table took off his glasses, and his jaw was shaking. If this story reaches you tonight, subscribe and stay with Wren all the way to the end. And tell me in the comments what city you're watching from so I can see how far her story travels. The morning the state of Vermont stopped being responsible for her, Wren Salter ate cold oatmeal and powdered milk that never fully dissolved no matter how long you stirred it. It was the same breakfast she had eaten every morning for 4 years in that house in Burlington. She ate all of it, not because she was hungry, because it was the last free thing anybody was going to hand her. And girls who grow up in placements learn early not to leave food on a plate they won't be sitting in front of again. Mrs. Doherty did not turn around when she pushed the paper bag across the counter. She was rinsing a coffee cup at the sink with her back to the room, and Wren understood that this was not cruelty. It was arithmetic. 12 kids in 14 years had walked out that front door on the morning of their 18th birthday, carrying a bag exactly like that one, and somewhere around the 5th or 6th, Mrs. Doherty had stopped looking at them. It was easier that way. Wren did not hold it against her. She had learned to do the same thing herself. Inside the bag was everything she owned: 2 pairs of jeans, 3 t-shirts, a hooded sweatshirt with a stain on the left cuff that had never come out, a pair of sneakers she had outgrown 8 months ago and could not afford to replace, and a cheap folding wallet with $187 in it. Every dollar she had saved from 3 summers of washing dishes at a diner on Riverside, minus the 20 she had spent on a bus pass she was about to use. That was it. That was her whole life at 18. Mrs. Doherty told her the bus left at 8:15 and not to miss it. She set it to the sink. Wren nodded, even though nobody could see her nod. She had learned young that nodding was safer than talking. She picked up the bag and the thin plastic handle cut into her palm, and she looked at that kitchen one last time. The curtains that had not been washed since she arrived at 14. The magnetic calendar on the refrigerator showing the wrong month. The chair with the wobbly leg nobody had ever bothered to fix in 4 years. She walked out the front door, and she did not close it behind her. There were 3 things Wren Salter knew about her mother, and she could recite all 3 of them in under 10 seconds. Her name was Sylvie Thorne. She died of heart failure at 39 in September of 2011, when Wren was 4. And Wren had been placed into the system that same week. That was the inheritance. A name, a cause of death, and a date. There was no photograph, there was no letter. There was not one memory Wren trusted, though she had spent years trying to build one. A woman's voice. A hand on her back. The smell of somebody's coat. She had learned by 12 that she was probably constructing those from nothing, the way a person builds a face out of static. And she had made herself stop. She sat at the bus stop with the paper bag on her knees and did not cry. She had quit crying at 11. Crying didn't change anything, and it made the other girls look at you a certain way, and once they looked at you that way, it did not stop. So she had trained her face to hold still, and by 18, she was so good at it that adults sometimes commented on how well she was handling things, which always struck her as the funniest thing anybody ever said to her. She was standing in line to board a bus to a transitional shelter in Rutland, an address a caseworker had written on an index card 3 weeks earlier, when her phone rang. Unknown number. Area code she didn't recognize. She almost let it go. Nobody had ever called her with good news in her entire life, and 18 years of that will teach you something. But her thumb moved before her brain did, and she answered. The voice on the other end was old. A man's voice. Careful, slow, the kind of speaking that comes from a person who has learned that the wrong sentence delivered too fast can knock somebody over. He asked if he was speaking with Miss Wren Salter. She said yes. He said his name was Harlan Voss. He said he was an attorney in a town called Quill Harbor, up on Lake Champlain. He said he had been trying to locate her for some time. And then he said the words that took her right out of that line. He said her grandfather had passed away in March at the age of 93, and that she was named in his will. Wren stepped out of the boarding line. A man behind her made an irritated noise, and she did not hear it. She walked to a bench against the wall of that station and sat down with the paper bag between her sneakers. And she heard herself say the word grandfather out loud, and it came out of her mouth wrong, like a word in a language she had only ever read. She was 18 years and 40 minutes old, and she had just said that word for the first time in her life. Harlan Voss said the name, Ambrose Thorne. He said the man had been looking for her for a very long time. Wren could not answer. Her throat had closed up in a way it had not closed since she was a child, and the old lawyer on the other end of the line did not fill the silence. He waited. He gave her the whole thing. She would think about that later, that the first adult who had ever given her room to not have words was a stranger on a telephone. When she could speak, she asked where Quill Harbor was. He said 3 hours north on the lake. He said if she could come, he would like to read the will to her in person, and that the family would be present. Wren looked down at the paper bag between her feet. She thought about the shelter in Rutland. She thought about $187. She said she would come. She traded her ticket at the counter, and it cost her $38 more to go north instead of south. And she sat by the window and watched the land change. Flat became rolling. Rolling became ridges. And somewhere past Middlebury, the lake opened up on her left, enormous and gray-blue, with the far shore of New York State floating on it like something imagined. She had never been that far north in her life. She pressed her forehead against the glass, and something in her shifted, though she could not have said what, and would not understand it for another day. The law office in Quill Harbor was on the second floor of a brick building above a dentist, up a narrow flight of wooden stairs that smelled like old carpet and lemon polish. Harlan Voss was waiting at the top. He was thin past 70, silver hair, straight back, reading glasses on a chain, and a gray suit that had been beautifully pressed sometime around 2009. He shook her hand, and his fingers were dry and warm, and he thanked her for coming as though she had done him a favor. He led her down a hallway to a conference room with a long wooden table, and there were already 2 people at the far end of it. The woman was in her 50s, silver blonde hair pinned at the nape of her neck, a cream blouse, a strand of pearls, pale pink nails, both hands folded on the table in front of her, like she had arranged them there for a photograph. She looked at Wren the way a woman looks at a stain on her own tablecloth. The man beside her was older by about a decade. Navy sport coat. He was scrolling on his phone with one thumb, and he did not look up when Wren entered the room. Not once, not even when Voss said her name. Voss introduced them quietly. Bernadette Thorne and Gideon Thorne, Ambrose's son, her uncle. The woman was her aunt by marriage. Bernadette gave her a small, tight smile that never got anywhere near her eyes, and said in a voice like a hostess seating a walk-in that so this was the one. Wren did not know what a person says to that. So she said nothing, which she had a great deal of practice at, and she sat down at the far end of a 9-foot table with a paper bag between her feet. Voss took his seat and opened a manila folder and put on his glasses. He looked at Wren over the rims for a moment before he started reading, and there was something in his face she did not understand until much later. It was pity. And underneath the pity running hot was something a great deal more like rage. He began to read. Last will and testament of Ambrose Elias Thorne, signed and witnessed on the 11th of February, 2015. Wren did the arithmetic in her head. 10 years before he died. He had been 83 when he wrote it. The house on Cedar Street, 3 bedrooms, corner lot, appraised at $428,000. To his son Gideon. The workshop at the edge of town, the equipment, the timber inventory, to Gideon. The savings and investment accounts, $355,000. To Gideon as trustee of the family estate. Her uncle did not look up from his phone through any of it. Bernadette's nails tapped the table once softly in what Wren recognized as satisfaction. Then Voss turned a page and his voice changed. It got careful. He read, "To my granddaughter, Wren Salter, daughter of my daughter, Sylvie, I leave the following." Bernadette's chin came up an inch. Her uncle stopped scrolling. 1 parcel of land on the north point, 4 acres, together with 1 structure. Appraised by the county tax office in 1994 at $5. There was 1 full breath of silence in that room. Then her uncle laughed. It was not a small laugh. It was not something that escaped him. It was a laugh performed out loud for an audience. And he leaned back in his chair while he did it, and shook his head, and he said $5 twice, like he wanted to be sure the room got it. He said that was the old man's boathouse out on the point. He said the county had tried to condemn it twice, and given up both times because it wasn't worth the paperwork. He said it had been sitting empty since before he was born, and that honestly, it wasn't worth the gas it would take to drive out and look at the thing. And Bernadette Thorne allowed herself a smile. Then she reached into her handbag and took out a brass key with a paper tag tied to it with twine. And on the tag in faded ink somebody had written NB9. She slid it across the long table toward Wren and let it come to rest halfway. She said the family had felt it was important that Wren receive something. She said they were being generous. Wren did not move for a moment. She looked at the key sitting on the table, and she understood with a clarity that surprised her exactly what was happening. She had been handed things like this before. A gift bag at Christmas at her 3rd placement that turned out to contain a used hairbrush and a coupon book. A birthday card at 15 signed by a caseworker who had spelled her name wrong. This was the same. It was a thing given so the giver could feel a particular way about themselves afterward. But the strange part, the part she would turn over in her mind for months, was that she felt no anger about it at all. What she felt was that she had been handed a key, and that she had never in her life had a key to anything. She reached out and picked it up. It was heavier than she expected. The brass was cold, and the paper tag was soft as cloth from decades of handling, and there was a wear pattern on the shaft, where somebody's thumb had gone back and forth across the same half-inch of metal for years and years. Somebody had carried this. Somebody had carried it in a pocket for a very long time. She asked where it was. Her uncle told her. County road out of town 6 miles, left at the fork, onto the dirt road all the way to the end of the point. He gave the directions the way you give directions to a place you have decided is nothing. Bernadette stood and gathered her handbag and smoothed a blouse that did not need smoothing and said they wouldn't take up any more of anyone's time. She walked out without looking back. Gideon followed. A door opened and closed somewhere down the hall, and their footsteps went down the wooden stairs. And then there was only Wren and Harlan Voss, and a paper bag and a brass key. The old lawyer sat there for a moment with his hands flat on the table. Then he said there was more she should know, but that it could keep until she was ready to hear it. He asked if she had anywhere to sleep that night. And Wren Salter, 18 years old, 4 hours out of the system, $149 left after the ticket, looked down at the key in her hand and said, without meaning it to come out the way it did, that she had a boathouse. Voss nodded slowly. And then he did something she had not expected. He opened a drawer in the credenza behind him and took out a cream-colored envelope and set it on the table between them. He said Ambrose had given it to him the same day he signed the will, 10 years ago. He said the instruction had been very specific. Voss was to hold it. And if the girl ever came to Quill Harbor herself, he was to put it in her hand. Not mail it, not forward it, not send it through the state. Only if she came. On the front of the envelope, in a careful, old-fashioned hand, was one word. Wren, just that, her name. She sat there and looked at it, and could not make her hand move because she was 18 years old, and she had never once in her entire life seen her own name written by somebody who loved her. She could not open it in that office. She could not do it with a stranger watching, however kind the stranger was. She put the envelope in the paper bag with her clothes, and she stood up and thanked him. Voss stood too. He offered his hand again, and when she took it, he held on a second, longer than a handshake needs. He told her that her grandfather had been the finest man he had ever known, and that he had known a great many men. Wren could not answer that. She did not trust her voice with it. She walked out of that office with a paper bag and a brass key, and a letter from a dead man who had known her name. And downstairs, a taxi was already idling at the curb because Harlan Voss had called one without being asked. The road out of Quill Harbor went pavement, then gravel, then dirt. The driver was an older man named Roy, who kept glancing at her in the mirror. Somewhere in the 4th mile, he asked if she was sure this was right. He said there was nothing out on the North Point, but old Ambrose Thorne's place. And Ambrose had been gone 6 months. She said she knew. He drove on. The last half-mile was barely a road at all, rutted and washed out from summer storms, branches scraping the sides of the car. Roy winced twice and did not turn around. And then the trees opened, and they came out onto the... And Wren saw it. And the first thing she felt was that somebody had made a mistake. Because it was not a ruin. It stood on a stone footing right at the edge of the rock. Dark cedar walls and a slate roof, the late sun coming across the lake and lighting the whole west face of it, gold. Vines had climbed the north wall. The dock below had gone, only its pilings left. The porch sagged a little at one corner, but the walls were plumb. The roofline was dead straight, 60 years alone on a lake that throws ice against that shore every single winter, and the thing stood there like it had been set down that morning. Roy whistled through his teeth and said, "Well, I'll be." She paid him. She stood in the clearing with her bag and watched the taxi reverse and turn and go, and the sound of it faded down the dirt road until there was nothing left but wind moving through the pines and somewhere above the point an osprey working the shoreline. Then she turned around and looked at the front door. It was thick, cut from a single slab of dark wood, and the entire face of it was carved. Vines and leaves running edge to edge, every leaf, with its veins cut, in every tendril turning and doubling back. She put her fingertips on it before she thought about what she was doing, and she stood there with her hand on that door for a long moment. Because whoever had done that had done it with a knife by hand, one cut at a time, and it must have taken months. Nobody carves a door like that for a shack. She put the brass key in the lock. It turned on the first try smooth, like it had been oiled that week. The door swung in. Inside, the air was cool and dry, and it smelled like cedar. Not damp, not mildew, not the smell of a building that has been sitting empty and losing a slow war. The smell of a room that had been closed on purpose and had been holding. Wren dug the flashlight out of her bag. A cheap plastic thing she had taken from the Doherty kitchen that morning, and she switched it on and swept the beam across the room. And she stopped breathing. Every wall was paneled in wood, and every panel had been hand-finished, and the grain ran from one board into the next, in a pattern that had been chosen and matched board by board, seam by seam, the way you would match a piece of music across a page turn. A stone fireplace stood on the inland wall, and the mantel above it was carved out of one long piece of black walnut, with a vine running its entire length. Leaves, small birds, a spray of berries cut in such fine relief that in the moving flashlight beam, the birds looked like they were about to leave. There was a bed frame in the corner, with turned spindles and mountain laurel worked into the headboard. Wren went and crouched down at the corner of it and looked at the joint where the rail met the post. No nails, no screws. Dovetails and pegs, every one of them. And after 60 years on a shoreline that goes from 90 degrees in August to 20 below in February, every joint was still tight. There was a table under the window, 2 chairs, a shelf along the north wall held up by brackets that had been carved into the shape of 2 open hands. She set the flashlight on the table and turned slowly in the middle of that room. She had expected a ruin. She had expected rot and mice and a roof caving in. She had expected the last insult from a family that had already taken everything else. And she had genuinely believed, riding out here in a taxi, that she was going to walk into a collapsed shed and then have to figure out where in the world she was going to sleep. This was not that. This was the most carefully made thing Wren Salter had ever stood inside in her life. She sat down on the edge of the bed. The frame did not shift an inch under her, and she did not know yet about the compartments behind the fireplace stones. She did not know about the 14 pieces sleeping in the walls, or the 4 journals, or the 147 letters that had all come back, or the daughter he had lost, or the granddaughter he had spent 30 years building a place for. All she knew sitting there was that a man had made this by hand, and that the hand that made it had known exactly what it was doing. She opened the paper bag and took out the envelope. She broke the seal. Inside was a single sheet folded once, and the handwriting was small and steady, and she read it by flashlight, while the light outside the windows went from gold to red to gray. He wrote that if she was reading this, she had come to the point, and that meant somebody had finally told her about him. He wrote that he did not know when she would read it or how old she would be. He wrote that he had rewritten this letter every year since he finished the Boathouse, and every year he had put it back in the envelope, and every year he had prayed that this would be the one. He wrote that he had not known her mother was gone until it was too late, that he had looked for her a long time, that the letters that came back were in the drawer and she would find them. He wrote that he had not known about Wren until he was already old, that he had heard about her the way he heard about most things at the end secondhand from a stranger, but that once he knew exactly what to do because he had been building this place for someone like her all along. He had just never known her name. And at the bottom, in that same steady hand, there is more in these walls than you can see. Look for the seams. When you find them, push. The wood will open. You are not alone. You were never alone. A man you never met has been thinking about you every day for a long time. Wren read it twice. Then she put her head down on a table her grandfather had built with his own hands, and, for the first time since she was 11 years old, she let herself cry. She cried until her chest hurt, and her nose ran, and her eyes burned. And she did not try to stop it, because there was nobody in 4 miles to see her do it. That was the thing she noticed afterward, lying on the bare slats of that bed frame, with a sleeping bag pulled over her. For the first time in 14 years, there was no one on the other side of a wall. No house parent doing a bed check. No girl in the next bunk who would remember in the morning. Nobody to perform being fine for. She had spent her whole life believing that being alone was the thing that would break her. She lay in her grandfather's boathouse in the dark and understood that she had never once actually been alone, not for a single night, and that the thing she had been calling loneliness had a completely different name. She slept 9 hours. She had not slept 9 hours since she was a child. She woke at first light with the letter still in her hand, and the words were sitting in her head before she opened her eyes. Look for the seams. When you find them, push. She got up and walked the room with her hand flat against the paneling. She had no idea what she was looking for. She ran her palm along every board on the west wall and found nothing but wood that had been sanded finer than anything she had ever touched. She did the north wall. She got down on her knees and went along the baseboard. She checked behind the shelf with the carved hands and behind the headboard and around the window casing. After 40 minutes, she was sweating and had found nothing at all. And the doubt arrived right on schedule the way it always did. She was 18. She had $149. She had no water, no food, no vehicle, and no way down off that point except her own 2 feet. And she was crawling around a floor looking for secret doors because a dead man had written her a letter. She sat back on her heels and made herself say it out loud. That grief makes old men write beautiful things, and that beautiful things are not the same as true things. That was when she heard the truck. It came up the dirt road, slow engine grinding in low gear, and Wren was on her feet with her heart going before she knew why. She had spent enough years in enough houses to know that unannounced vehicles are almost never good news. It was an old red pickup with rust along the wheel wells and a dented tailgate, and the woman who climbed out of it was somewhere in her 70s. Small, thin flannel shirt, rolled to the elbows, gray braid down one shoulder, a face weathered by about 50 winters on that lake. She came across the clearing, carrying a covered dish and a paper sack. She climbed the porch steps, and at the top she stopped and looked at Wren for a long moment without saying anything at all. Then she said very quietly, "Lord have mercy, you've got your mother's eyes." Wren could not speak. The woman said her name was Ottoline Bryce. Everybody called her Otto. And that she lived 2 miles down the shore road, and that she and Ambrose Thorne had been friends for 41 years. She said Roy, the taxi driver, had told his wife, and his wife told the diner, and the diner had told the whole town by 9 o'clock the previous night, and that Otto had gotten up at 5 to make the casserole. She held it out, chicken and rice still warm. There was a thermos of coffee in the sack, with little containers of cream and sugar because she hadn't known how Wren took it. Wren took the dish in both hands and looked down at it, and could not look at the woman's face, because nobody in 14 years had ever made her food and then driven it somewhere. Otto came inside. She sat across the little table and watched Wren eat, and did not fill the silence, which Wren was beginning to notice was something people in this town seemed to know how to do. When Wren had eaten all she could, Otto poured coffee into a tin cup she had brought along and pressed it into her hands. Then she asked if Wren had read the letter. Wren nodded. Otto said, "Then, you know, there's more in the walls." Wren said she'd been looking since dawn and couldn't find a thing. And Otto Bryce set down her cup and said that he had never shown her exactly, but that she had sat in this room 100 times, watching that man work, and she had an idea or two. She went to the fireplace first. She ran her weathered hand along the stones of the hearth low down, and she frowned, and she moved 4 inches to the left, and then she stopped and said, "Right here." Wren knelt beside her. And once Otto's finger was on it, Wren saw it. A line in the mortar joint running the height of one stone. Dead straight, too clean, not a crack, a cut. She put her hand flat against that stone and pushed. Nothing. She pushed harder with the heel of her hand and her shoulder behind it, and the stone moved a half-inch inward, and then something released behind the wall, and the whole section slid sideways with a soft grinding sound she felt through the floor. Cold air came out of the dark space behind it. Wren sat back on her heels and heard Otto breathe out very slowly and say, "Well, so that's how he did it." Wren reached into the compartment. Her fingers closed on something wrapped in oilcloth and tied with a leather cord, and she lifted it out with both hands, because it was longer than she expected, and she set it on the floor between them and untied the cord. She unrolled the cloth. Inside was a violin. A small one, a quarter size built for a child. Spruce top with a grain, so even it looked like still water varnish the color of dark honey. The ribs bent so tight and true they might have been machined. And where every violin in the world has a scroll, this one had a bird. A small bird, wings, folded head, turned to one side, carved into the wood, with a blade so fine the feathered lines looked drawn. Wren turned it over. She tipped it toward the window and looked in through the F-hole. And there was a paper label glued inside, hand-lettered in ink gone brown, A. Thorne, Quill Harbor, 1972. Otto put a hand on her shoulder. She said he made that the year your mother was born. Wren sat on the floor of a $5 boathouse holding a violin that was 53 years old, and she could not have said out loud what she was feeling, because there wasn't a word in her vocabulary for it yet. Then Otto said he made two. Your mother had the other one. She kept it on the wall of her bedroom in that house on Cedar Street from the time she was 4. It went with her the night she left. And Wren said the only thing she could think of, which was, you knew my mother. And Otto Bryce said, honey, I held her the day she came home from the hospital. They searched for the rest of the morning, and once Wren knew what a seam looked like, the seams were everywhere. 2 more compartments in the fireplace stones, 4 in the wall paneling, 1 behind the shelf, with the carved hands one high up where you'd have to stand on a chair. 1 low along the floor behind the little table. Each opened with a push. Each held something wrapped in oilcloth and tied off, and every knot in every cord was tied the same way, which somehow got to Wren harder than any of it. By noon, they had it all laid out across the floor. 4 full-size violins, signed and dated 1968, 1979, 1991, 2003. 2 violas. A cello disassembled and wrapped in 7 separate bundles, with a small wooden tag tucked in among them that read in his hand, "Assemble with care." No glue needed. A violin still clamped on its mold unfinished, the top not yet fitted. The last thing he had been working on. A case inlaid in maple and walnut in a border of interlocking leaves. 2 bows and a canvas roll of hand tools. Gouges, knives a thumb, plain a set of tiny chisels. And with a turned handle worn glassy and dark from decades of use. His own tools. Sealed inside the wall of his own house, oiled and wrapped so they would not rust while they waited. 14 pieces. Otto sat down on the porch step afterward with her hands in her lap and did not say anything for a long time. Then she said he was one of the finest luthiers in this country, Wren. In the world, probably. And almost nobody knew it because he never sold a single one. Not one. He had orchestras write to him. He had a dealer come up from New York in 1986 and sit in that room for 2 hours and leave with nothing. Wren asked why. And Otto said because he wasn't making them to sell. He was making them for somebody. He just didn't know who yet. Wren looked at the 14 pieces on the floor of that room and heard herself say out loud, "He made them for me." And Otto said, "Yes, honey, he did." They sat on that step and Wren asked her to tell it, all of it, from the beginning. Otto took a while gathering her words. She said Sylvie Thorne was born in 1972, the late child, the one nobody had been expecting anymore. Ambrose's wife, Clara, had given up hoping years before. And then Sylvie came. And Clara used to say she was worth every year of the waiting. She said Clara died when Sylvie was 14, fast, 3 months from the diagnosis. And after that, it was just the 2 of them. She said Sylvie played. Lord, that girl played. She used to sit right here on this step in the summer, with the quarter-size violin she'd outgrown years before, and refused to give up, and she'd play to the ospreys out over the water and swear up and down that they were listening. Ambrose thought she hung the moon. Then Gideon married Bernadette. Sylvie was 17. And Otto's voice changed, got flatter and more careful the way people's voices do when they are trying to tell something without letting the anger get into it. She said Bernadette had ideas about what the Thorne name meant and about what it did not. She said Bernadette told Ambrose things about his own daughter that were not true. That Sylvie was wild, that Sylvie was ungrateful, that Sylvie would embarrass the family, that people in town were talking, that something had to be done before it got worse. She said none of it was true. She said Sylvie Thorne was a girl who played violin to birds and fed peanut butter to the barn cats and wanted to be a veterinarian because she loved the way hurt things could be made better. She said Ambrose fought her. God in heaven, he fought her for 3 years. But Bernadette worked on him the way water works on stone, and she worked on Gideon, and she worked on everyone in that house until the air in it went cold, and by the time Sylvie was 20, she could not breathe on Cedar Street. And in the end, Otto said your mother made it easier on him. That was the part that killed Ambrose later. She packed a bag one night in the spring of 1992, and she left, and she took the violin, and she got on a bus south, and she never told a living soul where she was going. She was 20 years old, and she did it so her father wouldn't have to choose. Wren sat very still. Otto said Ambrose looked for her for 20 years. He hired a man in Albany. He drove down to Burlington himself 4 times. He wrote letters, so many letters, and every one of them came back stamped. She said he did not find out that Sylvie had died until a year after it happened in 2012, from a cousin who had seen a notice in a paper. And by then, Wren had already been placed, and the state would not tell him where, and Bernadette told him it was time to let it go. Wren asked in a voice that did not sound like her own whether he had, and Otto Bryce said no. She said he hired lawyers. He wrote the state 7 times. He wrote every placement agency in Vermont and half of New Hampshire. He got the same letter back every time with a different signature on it. And meanwhile, she said he built this, every winter and every summer, every year of the 20, board by board, piece by piece. Because he said if he could not have his daughter back, and he could not get to his granddaughter, then at least he could make something with his hands that would be standing here waiting when she came. She said he told Otto once, sitting on this step, even if it takes 100 years, someone will hand her the key and she'll come. Wren put her hand over her face, and the old woman beside her said, "Look at me, honey." Wren looked at her. Otto said he knew you'd come. He didn't know when and he didn't know how, but he built you a home. A real one made by hand, every board of it. He built you a home. Wren put her head against that woman's shoulder and cried again. And it was a different kind than the night before. This one felt like something in her that had been broken since she was 4 years old had finally been set and was beginning painfully to knit. That afternoon, Otto drove her down to Quill Harbor in the red truck. She bought Wren a plate of meatloaf at the diner and sat across from her and watched her eat all of it. She took her to the hardware store and introduced her to Walt Kerrigan, 60-some gray whiskers, soft voice. And Walt heard the name Thorne and came around the counter and shook Wren's hand with both of his. He said Ambrose Thorne co-signed a note in 1983 that kept his father's dairy farm from going under when the bank wouldn't touch them. He said his father paid back every dollar and never forgot it, and neither had he. He said anything she needed, she came to him first. He said it twice. Otto bought cleaning supplies, wood soap, a broom, a mop, a mattress pad, a pillow, 2 clean sheets, and would not let Wren pay for one item of it. She said Ambrose Thorne's granddaughter was not going to sleep on bare slats out on that point, not while Otto Bryce was still breathing. They cleaned until dark. The dust came up in clouds, and Wren had to prop the door open with a chair. And when they wiped the wall panels with soap, the wood came alive under the rags. Red gold heartwood, running through darker cedar grain matched seam to seam, and the whole room started to smell like something awake. Otto left at twilight. Wren walked her to the truck, and the old woman hugged her small and smelling of lavender soap, and then held her by both arms and then said one more thing. She said, "Tomorrow look for the last one." Wren asked what she meant. Otto said Ambrose had told her once that there was one compartment she'd never find because he'd built it for the person who came. He said whoever she was, she'd know it was hers because he'd written her name on it. Wren said he didn't know her name, and Otto said, "That's what I told him." And he said not the name they gave her, the one they didn't. Then she got in the truck and drove down the point and watched the taillights bounce and disappear and went back inside and lit the oil lamp Otto had left on the table. She found it that night. It was behind the little table by the window low, just above the floor. And she only found it because she moved the table to sweep under it, and the lamp threw the light sideways across the baseboard at an angle nobody would ever get standing up. A seam 6 inches long. She knelt and pushed, and a panel swung open on hidden brass hinges. She could not see, even with the lamp 2 inches away. Behind the panel was a cedar-lined space, and inside the space was a drawer. The face of it was polished cherry wood so smooth, it took the lamplight and gave it back warm. It ran the full width of the panel, and there was no handle on it. No pull. No latch, no catch, nothing to grip. She pulled at the edges. She pressed on the corners the way she had pressed the stones. She got her fingernails into the gap at the top and got nothing. Then she lay flat on the floor, with the lamp on its side beside her, and she ran her fingertips slowly along the underside of the drawer face where no eye would ever go, and she felt them, letters, carved shallow, cut so faint you would only ever find them by touch in the dark, by a person who had gotten down on the floor and refused to quit. 6 words, for the one they gave it to. Wren pulled her hand back like the wood had burned her. She sat up on her heels in the lamplight and read them again with her fingers, because she could not see them. And she felt something go through her that was not grief and was not joy, and had a great deal of fear in it. Because her grandfather had written those 6 words for a person he had never met, in a house he built alone at least a decade before she ever set foot in this county. He had known. He had known that his family would take the house and the workshop and the money. He had known that they would look at a boathouse appraised at $5 and see garbage, and that they would hand the garbage to whoever was standing there with nothing. Because handing worthless things to people they had wronged was the sort of thing they did and had always done and would do again. He had not hoped. He had counted on it. He had used the contempt of his own family as the delivery mechanism. And the person on the receiving end of that contempt, the one they gave it to, he had spent 30 years making a place for her without knowing her face, her age, her name, or whether she would ever exist at all. Wren lay back down on the floor and brought the lamp closer. And there below the letters, on the underside of the drawer, face, hidden completely in the shadow of the overhang, was a keyhole. It was no bigger than a grain of rice. She pulled the brass key up out of her collar. She had strung it on a piece of twine from the paper bag and worn it around her neck since Burlington without ever deciding to, and she held it up to the lamp. The main shaft was far too thick. Of course it was a door key. But the tip of it past the ward was worked down thinner, stepped on purpose to a smaller gauge, in a way that had no function whatsoever on a door lock, and that she had run her thumb over 100 times in the last 36 hours, without ever once asking why it was shaped like that. One key, two locks, cut 60 years apart by the same hand. She slid the thin tip into the hole and turned. There was a soft click, and the drawer released a 1/4 inch into her fingers, and cedar air came up out of it, sharp and fresh, as though the wood had been sealed the day before. Inside, stacked neatly, and filling the drawer end to end, were 4 leather-bound journals. And beside them, tied with twine, a bundle of letters 2 inches thick. Wren lifted the bundle out and set it on the table and pulled the string. The letters spread across the wood, and every single one of them was addressed in that same steady hand to Sylvie Thorne, and every single one of them had come back stamped in red across the face. Return to sender, address unknown. She counted them before she read a single one. She did not know why. She just sat there and counted. 147. The earliest was postmarked November of 1993, 18 months after her mother left Cedar Street. The latest was dated the spring before Ambrose Thorne died. 31 years of envelopes, everyone sealed, everyone stamped, everyone carried back up that dirt road by a mail carrier who must have hated that route by the end. She opened the first one with hands that would not hold steady. He wrote that he walked out to the porch every morning to see if she was coming up the road. He wrote that Otto told him he was foolish for it, and that he knew he was foolish and did not care. He wrote about a viola he had finished that month and where in the wall he had put it, and that he didn't know why he was hiding them, except that, when she came home, he wanted her to see what he had been doing while he waited. He wrote, "I don't need to know where you are. I only need to know that you're alive." Wren read that line and had to set the page down on the table. She read until the lamp burned low, and then she trimmed the wick and kept going. She read the letters from the 90s when the handwriting was still strong, and the man on the page still believed his daughter was going to walk up that road on her own. She read the ones from the early 2000s where the tone changed, where he stopped asking Sylvie to come home and started just telling her about his week, the way you talk to somebody in a hospital bed who can't answer. She read one from 2007 in which he apologized. 4 pages. He apologized for not throwing Bernadette out of his house the first night she started in on his daughter. He apologized for being tired. He wrote, "I chose peace over you. I have had 18 years to think about that, and I would give every one of them back." And then she got to 2012. The envelope was different. It had never been mailed at all. No stamp, no marks, just her mother's name on the front. He wrote that a cousin had sent him a clipping. He wrote that Sylvie had died the previous September, and he had not known for 11 months, and that he had spent those 11 months writing letters to a woman who was already gone. The handwriting on that page came apart halfway down. Wren could see the exact line where it happened. And at the bottom, he had written 5 words, and nothing else. I was too late. I was too late. Wren put her head down on the table in the dark and stayed there a long time. She would have stopped there. She was ready to stop. But there was a second bundle underneath the first. She hadn't seen it, tucked flat against the bottom of the drawer. And when she pulled it out and cut the twine, the letters that spilled onto the table were not addressed to Sylvie Thorne. They were addressed to my granddaughter, wherever she is, to Sylvie's child, to the girl I have not met. Wren stared at them for a full minute before she could touch one. There were more than 100. He had started writing them in the fall of 2013, the year he learned from a caseworker's letter that Sylvie Thorne had left behind a daughter, no name given, no location, the file sealed by statute. And he had written to that child every single month for 11 years until the winter he died. He wrote to her on Christmas. He wrote on the anniversary of Sylvie's death. He wrote on a day in June that he had picked at random and decided to treat as her birthday because he did not know when her actual birthday was, and he refused to let a year go by without one. He got it wrong by 2 months. Wren checked. He had chosen the 9th of June, and she was born in September. And somehow that was the detail that broke her worse than the sealed file, or the 11 months or any of it. That an old man had sat alone in the room every June 9th for 11 years and written happy birthday to a girl who was not having a birthday. He wrote about the work. He described every piece as he finished it, the wood, the varnish, the problems, what he'd done wrong. He wrote about a bad when his hands shook so badly, he ruined a scroll and had to start over at 88 years old. He wrote about the osprey pair that came back to the point every April and how he counted on them. And in almost every letter somewhere near the end, he wrote some version of the same 3 sentences. That she had been wanted. That somebody had been thinking about her the entire time. That there was a place for her and it was standing and it was not going anywhere. Wren read until the lamp went out on its own. Then she sat in the dark, with her hands flat on a stack of paper that a dead man had written to her before he knew she existed. And she said out loud to nobody. The thing she had never once said in 18 years of houses that were not hers. She said, "I'm here." Duncan Reyes came up the point 4 days later because Otto called him. He was a boat carpenter in his mid-50s, gray, at the temples, hands like slabs. He had built and ripped wooden hulls on that lake for 31 years. And he walked through Ambrose Thorne's boathouse the way a man walks through a cathedral, slow with his hat off, not touching anything. He was quiet for a long time. Then he told Wren he had been working wood in this valley since he was 17 and had never seen anything like it. Not close. He said the joinery in that bed frame alone was better than anything in any house in Quill Harbor, including the ones people drove out to photograph. He gave her a name in Boston. A man called Nathaniel Pike, who authenticated and appraised stringed instruments, and who Duncan said was the only person in New England whose word on this would actually mean something. And then he said he would pay Pike's fee out of his own pocket. Wren started to refuse. She had $112 left and no idea how to accept that kind of help. And Duncan Reyes raised one hand and stopped her. He said Ambrose Thorne bought lumber from his father every year for 40 years and never once haggled a price and never once paid an invoice late. He said that was who the man was. He said he owed him more than he could return and to let him do this. Pike drove up from Boston on a Thursday. He was tall, wire-rimmed glasses, early 60s, careful with his words, to the point of seeming cold. He carried a leather case with a bore scope, a loop calipers, and a small light. He spent 5 hours in that room and said almost nothing the entire time. He took the top off the mold on the unfinished violin and looked at the bass bar. He tapped the plates of the 1991 and listened with his head tilted. He looked at the hurfling on the cello under magnification. He put the little bird scroll violin from 1972 up against the window light and turned it over and over for 11 minutes without a word. And at one point, Wren saw him close his eyes. Then he sat down at the small table and took his glasses off and cleaned them on a handkerchief. And Wren realized his hands were not steady. He said he had handled 3 signed Thorn instruments in his entire career. A violin that came out of a private estate in Montreal in 2009. A viola sold at auction in 2016. A cello he had authenticated for an insurer 4 years ago. Each one had brought between $80,000 and $110,000. And each had been treated as an anomaly by the market because nobody could establish where they had come from or what else the man had made. He said, what was in this room answered that question. He said 14 instruments and works signed and dated, spanning the entire working life of the maker. The building itself, hand-built by him, intact with the compartments original to the construction. His personal tools. And 4 journals in his own hand, documenting the making of every single piece with dates, with wood sources, with his own corrections. He said that in the trade, the thing that is almost never available is provenance. And that this was not just provenance. This was a complete, unbroken, self-documented body of work, with the workshop preserved around it. He said he could think of no comparable surviving collection for any North American luthier of the 20th century. Then he gave her the number. Conservatively, for the instruments alone, 1.4 to 1.6 million. The Boathouse, as an intact preserved site, with the compartments and the tools, another 5 to 700,000. He said the journals were in market terms difficult to price, and in historical terms, the most valuable object in the room. Total conservatively, $1.9 to $2.3 million. Wren sat at her grandfather's table and could not make a sound. Duncan Reyes laughed once. Not cruelly. He laughed the way a man laughs when the world finally, after a long time, comes around. Right. The black SUV came up the point 5 days later. Wren heard it before she saw it, the wrong kind of engine on that road. And she set down the wood soap and walked out to the top of the porch steps and waited. And she noticed with some distant part of herself that her hands were steady. Bernadette got out of the passenger side in pearls and low heels that were not made for that ground. Gideon got out of the driver's side. And behind them came a third man in a dark suit with a leather briefcase and the polished look of a lawyer who bills in 6-minute increments. Bernadette stopped at the foot of the steps and looked up. She said there had been a misunderstanding. She said the family had been made aware of certain items inside the structure which had not been disclosed at the reading of the will. Family heirlooms. Personal property that formed part of Ambrose's estate and should have been distributed accordingly. She said they were here to correct the oversight. And then she smiled the same smile she had used in the conference room, patient, sharp at the edges. The lawyer stepped forward and introduced himself as counsel for the Thorn family estate, and said his clients were prepared to offer a very generous settlement for the return of the disputed items, $60,000 payable immediately, in exchange for a release surrendering all claim to personal property currently on the parcel, $60,000 for $2 million. Wren stood on that porch and did the arithmetic, and then did something else, which was look at her aunt properly for the first time. And what she saw was not a monster. That was the part that would stay with her. Bernadette Thorn was a woman in her 50s, standing in dirt in the wrong shoes, holding her handbag against her stomach with both hands, and she was afraid. She had spent 30 years being certain about the value of things. She had priced a man's entire life at $5 on a tax form and been right about it for 3 decades. And 11 days ago, a girl. She had thrown a key, it had gone up a road. Nobody in that family had driven in a generation. And now everything she had been certain about was upside down. Wren said no. Bernadette blinked. Once, but she blinked. The lawyer said smoothly that he didn't think Miss Salter understood. He said items of this kind were personal effects, not fixtures. He said under Vermont law, personal property held by a decedent passed through the estate, not through the deed of whatever building it happened to be sitting inside. And Wren said they were not sitting inside. They were sealed inside the walls in compartments built into the structure by the man who built the structure. She said the compartments were part of the house. The lawyer smiled a little and said that was a matter for a court. And Wren said then, they should have thought about that before they gave me the house. Bernadette's mouth went tight. She said they had been misled as to the value. And that was the thing that finally did it. Wren came down 2 steps. She said nobody had misled anybody. She said Bernadette had never been up here. Not once. Not in 30 years. Gideon had never been up here. Nobody in that family had driven this road since before she was born, and the reason was that they had decided long ago it was worthless. And the reason they had decided, that was that everything Ambrose Thorne touched, they had decided it was worthless. She said you thought he was worthless. She said you thought my mother was worthless. You told him she was. For 3 years in his own kitchen you told him. She said, and you thought I was worthless, and you handed me a key across a table in front of a lawyer so you could feel generous about it. Bernadette took half a step back. Then she recovered and said in a voice that had gone thin that this was a very dramatic interpretation. And Wren reached into her jacket pocket and took out the letter Harlan Voss had held for 10 years and held it up so the woman could see the handwriting on the envelope. She said her grandfather wrote this before she was old enough to read. She said he wrote in it that his family would consider this place worthless and that whoever they gave it to would be somebody they had wronged, and that he was counting on both of those things. She said he predicted you 10 years ago in writing. He knew exactly what you would do, and you did it. And you did it in front of a witness, and the witness kept the letter. Bernadette Thorne went white. Gideon stepped forward and started to say something about her tone, and Wren looked at him and he stopped, which surprised them both. She told them she was not selling. Not the instruments, not the tools, not the journals, not one letter, not one page of one letter. She told them they had given it to her on the record in front of an attorney, and it was hers. The lawyer cleared his throat and said something about legal exposure. And Wren Salter, 18 years old, $112, to her name said, then sue me. Nobody moved for a moment. And then Bernadette did something Wren had not expected and never fully explained to herself afterward. She looked past Wren through the open front door into the room. At the paneling, at the carved mantel, at the little bird scroll violin lying on the table by the window where Wren had taken to keeping it. And her face changed. It was not anger and it was not calculation. Wren had seen both of those on that woman and knew what they looked like. This was something else, and it lasted about 2 seconds. It was recognition. She saw what she had done. She saw the man whose daughter she had driven out of a house, and the granddaughter she had tried to hand a piece of garbage to, and 30 years of a life laid out inside a building she had priced at $5. And she saw, Wren thought later, the woman she had become in order to spend those 30 years believing she was right. Then it closed. Her face went smooth again. She said they would be in touch. They drove down the point, and Wren sat down hard on the top step, and her hands started shaking so badly she had to put them under her arms. And she stayed like that for 20 minutes until Otto's red truck came up the road. Otto had heard the SUV go past her place. She sat down on the step without being invited and did not say anything for a while. Wren finally said they were going to sue her. Otto said probably. Wren said she didn't know if she could win. And Otto Bryce said, you have the letters. You have 4 journals in his own hand. You have a will, and you have Harlan Voss, who has been waiting 50 years for a chance to help a thorn come out on top of that woman. Wren said she had no money. And Otto put an arm around her and said, honey, you have this whole town and you have the truth. And I have known Bernadette Thorne for 41 years. And I'll tell you what's going to happen. She is going to walk into a courtroom and she is going to lose because she stopped being able to recognize the truth a long time ago. And a judge is going to see straight through her in about 4 minutes. They filed the following Monday. The claim was that all personal property inside the structure, the 14 instruments, the tools, the 4 journals, and the correspondence, had not passed with the real estate and should be returned to the estate for redistribution. They were suing for every piece, including the letters. Harlan Voss took the case and would not take $1 for it. He told Wren that Ambrose Thorne had helped his family through a very bad year in 1974, and that he had been waiting 5 decades to return the favor, and that she was not to raise the subject again. Walt Kerrigan put a jar on the counter at the hardware store to cover expert fees and filing costs. 63 people in Quill Harbor put money in it in the first 8 days. $112 from the postmistress, $50 from the pastor's wife, $12 in 1s and 5s from the 2 waitresses at the diner who apologized for it. The elementary school teachers ran a bake sale and brought her $230 in an envelope. The county sheriff put in $100 with a note folded around it that said, only I remember your grandfather. Duncan Reyes agreed to testify on the construction. Nathaniel Pike agreed to testify on the appraisal and drove up twice more at his own expense. Otto agreed to testify about Sylvie and about the letters and about a night in March of 1992. And Wren did the one thing she had not thought she could do. She read all 4 journals cover to cover, 47 years of entries, by lamplight night after night, until she could have told the story of Ambrose Thorne's life as though it were her own, which she was beginning to understand it was. The trial was set for a Wednesday in late October in a small paneled courtroom in Burlington, in a building 40 minutes from the house where she had eaten cold oatmeal on the last morning of her childhood. Half of Quill Harbor drove down and filled the gallery behind her. And Wren Salter walked in there in a second-hand jacket with a brass key on a piece of twine around her neck and sat down at the defense table and looked across the aisle at the woman who had handed her a $5 Boathouse and called it generosity. Judge Marion Hartwell was in her 60s, steel gray hair, a face that gave away exactly nothing, and she had been on that bench 19 years. The Thorne lawyer went first, and Wren had to admit he was good. He was not theatrical. He cited 3 Vermont cases on the distinction between fixtures and chattels, walked the judge through each one in plain language, and made a clean, unemotional argument that concealed personal property discovered in a structure after transfer of title does not automatically convey with the real estate, and that the burden was on the defendant to show the decedent had intended otherwise. He sat down after 11 minutes. Then Harlan Voss stood up, and he did not cite a single case. He walked to the clerk's table with 4 leather-bound journals under his arm and laid them out in a row. And he asked the court's permission to enter them into evidence. And then he opened the 4th one to a page he had marked with a strip of paper. He said the plaintiff's entire position rests on the claim that Ambrose Thorne did not intend for the contents of this building to pass to his granddaughter. I would like the court to hear Mr. Thorne answer that question himself. And he read. The entry was dated the 9th of April, 2014. Finished the cello today. That's 14. The boathouse is done. There is nothing left in it that isn't hers. Everything I have made that was worth keeping is inside these walls now. When they give this place away, they will not know what they are giving. That is what I have counted on. That has been the whole point of it. Voss closed the book. He said quietly that Ambrose Thorne had known for at least 11 years that his own family would consider this property worthless. He said the man knew it because he had spent 50 years watching them undervalue his work and his hands and his daughter. He said he sealed the instruments inside the structure precisely so they would pass undetected to a person of his choosing. That is not evidence of an unintended transfer. That is evidence of the most deliberate transfer this court is likely to see this year. He said the boathouse was the vehicle. The contents were the gift. And the intended recipient was named in the will and in the final letter, and her name is Wren Salter, and she is sitting at that table. Judge Hartwell wrote something down. Then she looked over her glasses and asked whether counsel had that final letter with him. Voss said he did. She said enter it and read it into the record. He read every word of it. His voice did not perform anything. It was an old man, another old man's handwriting out loud in a room full of strangers. And it was worse that way and better. He read the part about rewriting the letter every year and putting it back in the envelope. He read this part about not knowing her name. He read the instruction about the seams. And when he got to the last 2 lines, "You are not alone. You were never alone," the postmistress in the 3rd row of the gallery put her hand over her mouth, and Walt Kerrigan wiped his face with the back of his wrist and did not care who saw him do it. Wren did not look at her aunt. She did not need to. Otto Bryce took the stand next and told the whole thing. She told the court about Sylvie Thorne as a girl. She told them about Clara dying when Sylvie was 14, and about the years afterward when it was just the 2 of them. She told them about the night in the spring of 1992, when a 20-year-old took a bag and a violin and got on a southbound bus so that her father would not have to choose. Then she told them about the letters. She said she had personally watched Ambrose Thorne walk into the Quill Harbor post office once a month for over 2 decades and mail a letter that came back. She said he did it in weather that kept other men indoors. She said the postmistress could confirm every word of it. And in the 3rd row of the gallery, a woman in her 60s stood straight up and raised her hand and said out loud that she could, that she had mailed most of them herself and stamped most of them when they came back, and that she had cried in the sorting room more than once doing it. Judge Hartwell told her to sit down. She did not tell her to leave. Then Wren took the stand. Voss asked her only 4 questions. Who she was, how she had come to learn her grandfather existed, what she had found in the walls, and whether she would read one letter aloud to the court. She had chosen it 3 nights earlier, and had not been able to get through it once in practice. It was dated June the 9th, 2018. He had addressed it as he always did in those years to Sylvie's child. She read, "You are 11 today, I think. I don't know for certain, and I never will, so June the 9th is what I have decided on. And I hope you'll forgive an old man for guessing. I turned 87 this year, and my hands still work, which is the only prayer I have left that keeps getting answered. I finished a viola this month. It is not my best. The scroll fights me now in a way it never used to. But I was happy the whole time I was making it. And that is a thing you should know about me. When I am making something, I am happy, and I am always making something, because I am always thinking about you. Some people would tell you a man cannot love a child he has never met. I would tell those people they do not know what love is. I love you, Sylvie's child. Wherever you are tonight, please know that. And when you can, come home." Wren got to the last 3 words and stopped. She sat in that witness box in front of a courtroom and a judge and 40 people from Quill Harbor, and could not make her throat work. And Judge Hartwell let the silence sit there for a good 10 seconds before she said gently that the witness could take a moment. Wren took it. Then she said she had nothing further, which was not the correct thing to say from a witness box, and nobody corrected her. And then the Thorne lawyer, who was not a bad lawyer and who had held a perfectly respectable position for 2 hours, made the mistake that ended it. He called Bernadette Thorne to the stand. He had to. That was the thing Voss explained to Wren afterward. Their entire case now rested on the decedent's state of mind. And the only witness they had, his state of mind, was his son's wife. Bernadette sat up very straight, with her hands folded in her lap, and answered his questions in a calm, reasonable voice. She said Ambrose had been a difficult man, reclusive, resentful of his family in his later years. She said he had built the boathouse as a retreat from them and had never shared what he kept in it. She said if the family had known there were items of value inside the property, would never have been transferred, and that the entire distribution had been made under a mistaken belief as to its worth. It was a good answer. It was the only answer available to her, and Harlan Voss stood up for cross-examination with nothing in his hands and asked one question. He asked her whether it was true that she had spent 3 years working to drive her father-in-law's only daughter out of the family home. Her lawyer was on his feet before Voss finished the sentence, relevance. And Voss said, "Your Honor, the plaintiff has just characterized Mr. Thorne as a resentful and reclusive man, and has asked this court to draw conclusions about his intent from that characterization. The record should reflect the source of the resentment." Judge Hartwell looked at Bernadette for a moment. Then she said, overruled, "Answer the question, Mrs. Thorne." Bernadette opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. She said that was a family matter. And Voss said, "Is that a denial?" She said it was a long time ago. And Voss said, "Is that a denial, Mrs. Thorne?" And she said nothing at all. He let the silence run for about 4 seconds. Then he walked back to the clerk's table and picked up the second journal. He asked whether it was true that on the evening of March the 11th, 1992, in the kitchen of the family home on Cedar Street, she had told Ambrose Thorne. And he said he would quote from a journal entry the decedent had written in his own hand within an hour of the conversation. "If that girl is under this roof one more night, I will take Gideon, and I will go, and you will lose the last child you have left." Wren watched her aunt's hand come off her lap and grip the rail of the witness box. Bernadette said she did not remember saying that. Voss asked if she denied saying it. She said she did not remember. He asked a third time. He was not cruel about it. He asked it the way a man asks a question he already knows the answer to, and wishes he did not have to ask at all. And Bernadette Thorne said for the third time that she did not remember. Voss turned to the bench and asked to read the full entry into the record. Hartwell said he could, and he read the whole page, all of it. A father's handwriting on the night he lost his daughter, the threat, and then his own weakness, and then 2 lines near the bottom, where he wrote that he had said nothing, that he had stood in his own kitchen and said nothing, and that he did not know how he was going to live with it. The courtroom did not make a sound. Judge Hartwell folded her hands and looked at Bernadette Thorne for a long moment. Then she said, "You may step down, Mrs. Thorne." Bernadette stepped down. She walked back to the plaintiff's table without looking at anyone, and she sat, and she did not raise her head again for the rest of the afternoon. The judge did not take it overnight. She came back after a 40-minute recess and read her ruling from a legal pad, and it took her under 3 minutes. She found that the transfer of the North Point parcel from the estate of Ambrose Elias Thorne to Wren Salter had been made with full and specific intent as to the contents of the structure, and that the decedent's intent was documented contemporaneously, extensively, and unambiguously in his own hand. She found that the compartments were original to the construction and integral to it. She denied these plaintiffs' claim in full. She ruled that all personal property inside the boathouse, the 14 instruments and works, the tools, the 4 journals, and the correspondence, was the sole and exclusive property of Wren Salter. She assessed costs to the plaintiffs. Then she took her glasses off and looked down at Wren. She said, "For whatever it's worth, Miss Salter. Your grandfather sounds like he was a fine man, and I'm sorry you didn't get to meet him." Wren could not answer. She nodded. And behind her, Walt Kerrigan stood up in the gallery and clapped once, one loud crack in a quiet courtroom, and then the entire row of Quill Harbor was on its feet. And Judge Marion Hartwell, who had run a tight room for 19 years, let it go on for 11 seconds before she reached for her gavel. Bernadette Thorne walked out of that courtroom without her handbag and had to send her husband back in for it. Wren rode home in the passenger seat of Otto's red truck with the window cracked and the 4 journals in a canvas bag on her lap because she would not put them in the back. Otto drove one-handed and hummed something with no name to it. After about 20 miles, she said, "Well, that's over." Wren asked if it really was. And Otto said, honey, Bernadette Thorne will never set foot on that road again as long as she lives. Not out of shame. She hasn't got that. Out of something worse, she can't afford to. Because every time she comes up, that point, she'd have to look at what she priced at $5, and there is not a woman alive who can do that twice. Wren watched the lake go by on her right and did not say anything for a while. Then she said quietly that she almost felt sorry for her. And Otto said that was because Wren had been raised by strangers and had somehow come out kinder than the people who had money and a name and a house on Cedar Street, and that if Ambrose could have heard her say that sentence, it would have finished him. The final appraisal came in 3 weeks later at $2.3 million. The offer started before the ink was dry. 2 museum curators, a conservatory in Montreal that wanted the whole collection on permanent loan, and made it clear the loan would come with a very large donation attached. A dealer from New York who called 4 times in 6 days, and a soloist a real one, a name Wren had to look up, who offered $700,000 cash for the Little Bird scroll violin from 1972. He said he would drive up from Boston and put it in her hands himself. He said he had played on a thorn once, borrowed for a single recording session in 2011, and had thought about it every year since. Wren sat at her grandfather's table with a phone in her hand and let herself picture it honestly, because she felt she owed the girl with a paper bag that much. $700,000 for one object out of 14. An apartment with a lease in her own name, heat all winter, a car that started, school anywhere she wanted with no forms and no signatures and no caseworker. Never again standing in a room while somebody with a clipboard decided what happened to her next. She wanted it so badly, her hands went cold. And then she thought about what selling that violin actually meant. It meant the quarter-size instrument her mother had learned on, the twin of the one Sylvie carried onto a southbound bus at 20 years old. And that had gone wherever Sylvie went and had never come back, would go to Boston in a climate case. It meant the cello would go to Montreal, and the 1991 would go to a collector in Connecticut, and the tools would go into a museum drawer with a card in front of them, and the unfinished violin, still clamped on its mold, would be conserved exactly as it was and never touched again. And this room would have empty walls, because the thing her grandfather spent 30 years building was not 14 instruments. Wren understood that with total clarity, sitting at that table. It was the way they belonged together, and the way they belonged in these walls, and the way all of it belonged to a person the world had already thrown out. Take them apart, and you would have 14 valuable objects in 14 cities, and not one person in any of those rooms would know what a single one of them meant. She turned down every offer, every one, including the $700,000. And on a Thursday in November, with $112 in a wallet and a $2.3 million collection in the walls, Wren Salter did something nobody in Quill Harbor expected. She opened the Boathouse. It started with 11 people. Otto told the women at the Methodist church. Walt Kerrigan taped a sheet of paper in the window of the hardware store. Harlan Voss mentioned it at the courthouse in a voice loud enough to carry. And on the first Saturday in December 11, people drove up that dirt road in 4 vehicles and stood in the clearing not quite sure whether they were allowed to come up the steps. Wren gave the tour herself. She had rehearsed it for 2 days and forgot all of it in the first 30 seconds, so she just started talking. She showed them the paneling and how the grain ran board to board. She had them put their own hands on the fireplace stone and push, and watched grown adults jump when the section slid sideways. She let a retired school teacher hold the 1979 violin, and the woman's hands shook so badly that Wren had to keep 2 fingers under the scroll the whole time. She read them 1 page from the second journal. She told them about the letters that came back, and halfway through, a man in his 80s near the back said out loud that he had sold Ambrose Thorne his first set of gouges in 1961 and had wondered for 60 years what the man was doing with them. That was when Wren understood what she had actually done by opening the door. By the 3rd Saturday, there were 40 people. By February, the ferry line at Charlotte was directing cars, and a woman drove up from Springfield, Massachusetts, because her cousin had told her about it at Christmas. They came for the instruments. That was what got them up the road, but they stayed for the other thing, the thing Wren had not planned and could not have planned, which was that every single person who came had known Ambrose Thorne, or had known somebody who had, and none of them had ever been inside this building. They had known him for 60 years as a quiet man who bought lumber and paid his bills on the day and did not come to things. And now they were standing inside the answer. An old woman named Grace Pelletier came in March and cried in the doorway before she got 3 feet into the room. She said Ambrose had fixed her son's school violin in 1988 for free in one night and would not take $1, and had told her not to mention it to anyone. She said she had never mentioned it. She said she was mentioning it now. A man named Carl Dubois said Ambrose had plowed his driveway every storm for 2 winters after Carl's back surgery, and had never once knocked on the door to be thanked. Walt Kerrigan told a story about a bad October in 1983 that Wren had already heard and told it again anyway, and cried this time. It went on like that for months. People came up the point and looked at the walls, and then almost every time told Wren something about her grandfather that they had been carrying around alone. And by the end of that first winter, Wren understood exactly what her grandfather had built. He had not built a workshop. He had built a room where his own funeral, 10 years overdue, never properly held, attended by nobody, because he had made himself into a man nobody thought to attend, could finally take place. Not with grief, with witness. The place got a name by itself. Nobody voted on it. People just started calling it the Thorn Studio. And a sign painter in Vergennes made her a small board for the bottom of the dirt road that said so with 3 words under it: Open Saturdays. Visitors welcome. Duncan Reyes rebuilt the porch so it would stop sagging and would not take $1 for the labor. Walt sold her a wood stove at cost and delivered it himself. Nathaniel Pike came up from Boston twice more on his own time to advise on humidity control, and then a 3rd time with no professional excuse at all, and stayed for dinner. Wren started charging $12 a head for the Saturday tour. It paid for the mattress she finally bought in March. It paid for the well pump Duncan installed in April. It paid for firewood and the truck she got in June for $1,100. And eventually, slowly, for a wiring job that let her stop reading by oil lamp. She was not rich. She has said since that she went from having $112 to having about $400 on a good month, and that she has never once regretted it and never once been confused about why. What she had instead was a life she got up inside of every morning. In April, she started teaching. 6 kids the first Saturday afternoon, ages 8 to 14, from Quill Harbor and Ferrisburg. She used her grandfather's tools, the small gouges, the thumb plane, and the instructions out of his journals, which turned out to contain page after page on grain direction and blade angle, and the exact temperature of hide glue. All of it written in the plain, patient voice of a man explaining something to somebody who was not yet there. Wren was not a luthier. She was not remotely close. The first scroll she attempted came out lopsided and gouged, and she got within about 4 seconds of putting it in the stove. She didn't. She kept it on the shelf where the students could see it, which turned out to be the single most useful teaching object in the room. She practiced at night alone badly for a long time. By that first summer, she could carve a decent F-hole. By the second, under Duncan's supervision, she completed a full violin body that Nathaniel Pike examined for a long time and described, choosing his words, as promising. She was good enough to teach children. That was all she had ever needed to be. Otto slowed down that winter. She turned 74 in January, and the cold got into her hip, and she stopped driving the truck after dark. Wren started going down every morning. She'd make the coffee and sit at Otto's kitchen table and listen. And Otto, who had been sitting on 41 years of a dead friend and 20 years of a dead girl, started remembering things she had not remembered in decades, small things. That Sylvie fed peanut butter to the barn cats and got hollered at for it. That she hummed while she did homework and did not know she was doing it. That she wanted to be a veterinarian because she loved that hurt. Things could be made better. Wren wrote all of it down. A blue leather notebook. She kept it in the cedar drawer next to her grandfather's 4. That was the year she stopped thinking of her mother as a name on a state form and started thinking of her as a girl who had been happy on that point. A reporter from Burlington came up in May and wrote a long piece with a photograph of Wren on the porch holding the 1972 violin. The headline was 4 words: "The Boathouse they priced at $5. 2 regional papers picked it up. Then a national magazine about American folk art, and then in September, a segment on Vermont Public that ran 9 minutes and got emailed around. The Saturday crowds doubled, then doubled again. The offers came back 2 larger this time, and Wren said no to all of them, again faster now without the cold hands. And that was the autumn the letters started arriving. Not many. 4 or 5 a month at first. From women mostly. From people who had seen the article or heard the segment and had sat down and written to a stranger because there was nobody else to tell. I aged out in Ohio in 1994. Nobody was looking for me either. I wanted you to know somebody read your story and understood it. My grandmother left me a house everyone told me to sell. I sold it. I have thought about that every week for 9 years. I am 61 years old, and I found out last spring that my father wrote me letters I never got. I don't know why I'm telling you this. Wren answered every single one by hand. It took her most of Sunday, every Sunday. She kept the replies short because she never knew what to say, and it did not seem to matter. The people who wrote back said it had mattered. She put the letters in a box under the table by the window. By the following summer, the box was full, and she got a second one. In December of that first year, she was on her hands and knees on the porch, replacing a warped board, when her fingers found something on the underside of the bottom rail. 2 letters, cut shallow into the wood, where nobody would ever see them. St. Wren sat back on her heels in the cold and read them again with her thumb, because she could not quite believe it with her eyes. Her mother had carved those. She would have been 10, 11, maybe. Small enough to be under that rail, old enough to be trusted with a knife. She had done it on the underside, hidden, where you would only find it if you were down on the floor working, which meant she had done it to be found eventually by somebody who loved this porch enough to fix it. Wren put her thumb on the letters and stayed down there a long time in the cold. And she understood something she had missed for a whole year. She had been walking around this place thinking of it as a gift built for her by a man she never met. As though the whole 30 years had been about a girl in Burlington who did not exist yet. That was wrong. Sylvie Thorne had loved this place first. Sylvie had sat on this step and played to the ospreys, and had been happy here as a girl before Bernadette came into that family and made the air go cold. Sylvie had put her name on this porch when she was 10 years old. Wren had not been the first one this house held. She was only the most recent. And then on a morning in October one year, to the week, from the day she first climbed those steps, a car she did not recognize came slow up the dirt road. A small blue sedan, the paint gone chalky, the rear bumper held on with duct tape. It rolled into the clearing, and the engine cut off with a tired sound. The girl who got out of the driver's side was 16, maybe 17. Dark hair pulled back. A jacket much too thin for October in Vermont. A duffel bag over one shoulder. And she stood there in the clearing, looking at the boathouse, in a way Wren recognized down to the bone. Not curious. Bracing. The posture of a person who has already decided she is going to be turned away and has come anyway, because there is nowhere else. Wren came out onto the porch. The girl saw her and lifted one hand about 6 inches, which was as much of a wave as she could manage, and called up that she was looking for Wren. Wren said she was Wren. The girl said she had read about this place in a newspaper somebody had left in a diner outside Glens Falls. She said she had been driving 2 days. She said she was sorry to come without calling, and then she said quieter that she hadn't known how to call. Wren looked at her, at the duffel bag, at the car that almost certainly had everything the girl owned in the back of it, at the thin jacket, at the way she was standing with her weight already shifted toward the driver's door in case this went badly. She recognized every piece of it, all of it. There was not one detail she had to guess at. She asked if the girl had eaten. The girl said not since yesterday. And Wren Salter said, "Come up. The coffee's hot." Her name was Marisol Vance. Everybody called her Mari. She came up the steps and stopped at the carved door and put her fingertips on the leaves the way every single person did, careful, like she was afraid they might come off in her hand. Then she stepped inside and stopped in the middle of the room, and her eyes went across the paneling and the mantel and stopped on the little bird scroll violin on the table by the window, where Wren kept it in the light so the Saturday visitors would see it first. She said he made all this. Wren said every piece. Mari asked who for, and Wren said for whoever came. It wasn't for me exactly. He didn't know my name when he started. He built it for the person the world was going to throw away next, and that turned out to be me. She made the girl coffee and sat her at the small table and reheated what was left of the stew Otto had sent up. Mari ate the way a person eats when she has not sat at a table in weeks and then apologized for it, and Wren told her not to. Halfway through, Mari looked up at the violin and asked the question everybody asked. She said the article had said $2.3 million. She asked why Wren hadn't sold. Wren had answered that question probably 300 times by then. She could do it in 4 sentences and usually did. But something about this girl at that table made her want to get it right. She said a man I never met built all of this for a person he never met. And when I got here, I finally understood what he'd actually done. He didn't leave me money. He left me a place. She said, and a place is only a place if it stays where it is. She said, if I'd sold the instruments, this would be a room with empty walls and a nice story attached to it. And a story is not the same thing as a home. A story is what you have left after the home is gone. Mari looked at her for a while. Then she asked in a voice that came out very small whether she could stay. Just a night or 2. She said she could sleep in the car. She said she wouldn't be any trouble. The spring before, Duncan Reyes had built a small room onto the back of the boathouse. Wren had asked him to, and had never been able to explain to anybody, including herself, why. It was a single room with a cot, a wood stove, a window, and a light on its own switch. It cost her $400 in materials and 11 Saturdays of Duncan's time, which he again would not bill her for. She had told him at the time she thought she might need storage. She had never once put storage in it. She said, "There's a room in the back. It has a cot and a stove. You can stay as long as you need to." Mari's eyes filled and she looked hard at the table. But before Wren showed her the room, she took her out onto the porch. She knelt down at the bottom rail and ran her thumb along the underside until she found the two letters. And then she moved her hand so Mari could get down there and feel them too. She asked if Mari had a knife. Mari reached into her jacket pocket and came out with a small folding pocket knife and looked completely lost. Wren told her my mother carved her initials here. She was about 10. I found them last December under the rail, where nobody would ever see them. She said she used to sit on this porch. She loved this place before I was born. She was happy here. Then she said, "I want you to put yours next to hers." Mari asked why, and Wren said, "Because from now on, every girl who stays in this house puts her name on this porch. That's the rule. It's a new rule. I made it up about 4 seconds ago." Then she said, "But I think my grandfather would have liked it because he spent 30 years leaving a mark for somebody he was never going to meet. And this is the same thing pointed forward instead of back." Marisol Vance knelt down on the boards, and with a hand that shook only a little, she cut 2 letters into the underside of that rail beside Sylvie Thorne's. MV. Then she stood up and looked at Wren and started to cry. Not loudly, the quiet kind, the kind that comes out of a person when nobody has been kind to them for so long. That ordinary kindness breaks something open. Wren put an arm around her shoulders and held on. The same way Otto Bryce had held her on that step, on that exact board 13 months before. Mari fell asleep in the back room a little after 9. Wren stepped out onto the porch afterward and sat down in her usual spot with her back against the rail, where she could feel the carved letters through her jacket. ST and now 4 inches over MV. 2 girls the world had done its best to erase with their names cut into the same porch by the same knife a year apart. She thought about her grandfather. About a man who wrote 147 letters that all came back and then wrote 100 more to a child whose name he did not know. About a man who guessed at her birthday and got it wrong by 2 months and never stopped guessing. About a man who carved 6 words on the underside of a drawer where only somebody sat on the floor and refusing to quit would ever find them for the one they gave it to. He had built a place. That was what he had done, and it was bigger than one person, which she had not understood at first. It was never only for her. Inside, the 14 pieces were sleeping in the walls where he had put them. The 4 journals were in the cedar drawer with a 5th beside them, now blue in her handwriting. 2 boxes of letters from strangers were under the table by the window. Otto was 2 miles down the shore road, and Wren would drive down in the morning with the bread she liked. Mari was asleep in the back room, and she would still be there tomorrow and the day after, and for as long as she needed to be. Wren Salter was 18 years old the morning she walked out of a house in Burlington with $187 and a paper bag of clothes, and she believed, with her whole chest, that she was alone in the world. She was wrong. She had never been alone for a single day of her life. A man she never met had loved her every day of his, and had loved her mother before her. And when he could not get to either of them, he took the only thing he had left, 2 hands and 60 years, and built a place so that whenever she finally came home, there would be a home standing there to come to. That was what he did. That is the whole story. And now with what he left her, Wren Salter is doing exactly what he did. She is keeping a place. She is keeping the door open and the coffee hot and a cot made up in a room out back. And she is waiting on the next one. The world decides to throw away because there is always a next one. And when that girl comes up the dirt road with a duffel bag on her shoulder and a jacket too thin for the weather and a face that does not know whether she will be turned away, Wren will be standing on that porch, and she will call down the same 4 words every time. Come up, the coffee's hot. The Sal